Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Pam Olson, and I'm very pleased to be joined today by Carol Stubbings, who's PwC's Global Tech Services Leader. Carol, welcome to Policy on Demand.
Hi, Pam. It's great to see you again, and it's great to be in Washington.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you here. You're at our Global Tax Symposium, the U.S. version. There was, of course, a European version a couple of weeks ago. And I'm really curious, since you come across the pond, what are the differences or similarities that you see with companies here in the U.S. versus companies in Europe?
Yeah, so I think the Europeans like to think that there's more differences than similarities. I would say there's probably more similarities. I mean, we know that the world is polarized. We know that we have high inflation. We know that we've got fiscal deficits that are eye-watering that need to be replenished. We know that there are high interest rates. We know that there is a real energy crisis. So there's lots of similarities in the world. What I would say about Europe more specifically is the war on Ukraine feels really real. It's right on the doorstep. The energy crisis is acute and continues to be so. We don't see any stop in that war anytime soon. We think we're going to be fine this winter, but next winter is potentially a challenge. But we've also got the climate crisis. And I guess one of the challenges in Europe particularly is as companies think about getting to net zero, with the cost of energy being so stark, we've started to see kind of dirty energy come back into play in a way that people really don't want to happen. So there are specific issues, I think, in Europe. What's really interesting is in Europe, unlike the US, there is a bit of an anti-business sentiment. And I was kind of reflecting with some of my colleagues as to why that is. And that's really manifesting in a number of ways. I think in Europe, we have an incredibly rich welfare state, welfare system. And there's this real correlation and this real link in people's minds that if companies aren't paying their fair share of tax, then the person on the street suffers. They suffer, they don't get the right education, they don't get the right healthcare, they live on the poverty line. So that's kind of creating a bit of this anti-business sentiment. And we all know that, if you want to replenish your fiscal deficits, the cost of servicing those deficits has increased significantly because of the interest rates, right? So governments kind of typically have two levers. They cut spending and they increase taxes. So we are seeing a whole myriad of new taxes being introduced. Again, in very kind of isolated ways. So companies will first and foremost look at their own country and then worry about what impact that has from an international perspective. So we're seeing a lot of turbulence, a lot of turmoil, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of kind of political instability, particularly in the country that I'm from, in the UK. And that's really creating a lot of fragility in terms of how people are thinking. And actually, if we look at kind of coming out of COVID, not only did we create those fiscal deficits, but we saw our companies and our businesses undergo massive transformation and change, whether that's supply chain, acceleration of movement to the cloud, lack of talent. So all of those things have been going on. And I would say kind of the only thing that's certain is uncertainty. And having to operate in uncertainty can be really challenged. I think, particularly we've been talking about Pillars 1 and Pillars 2 here. We spent a lot of time talking about that in Europe. I mean, I think the sentiment is the same, actually. I know we have our differences in perspectives. I think there is real concern that actually is Pillar 2 really going to happen? I think there is real concern about how companies and governments actually enact and enforce Pillar 2. We know that not all governments within Europe are for it. I mean, you've got Germany, you've got France, you've got Italy. They are definitely kind of advocates for it. Ireland will adopt it if it has to. You've got Hungary that says it doesn't like it, but I think there will be a quorum, and I do think kind of 2024 will be the year. That the real danger, though, or the real challenge, is, can the governments actually administer it, or can they get themselves ready to administer it by that date? And talking to lots of clients, a real concern around how are we going to remain compliant, and how are we actually going to meet our, our objectives. But the other thing that's slightly different in Europe is, and again, I think it's coupled with all of this kind of sentiment around, tax and society, is tax transparency. So we know that, the Europeans have been leading the way in tax transparency for a number of years. But actually with the climate crisis, and the voice of the employees, the voice of the stakeholders, the voice of the shareholders, actually, making sure that your tax policy aligns with your business objectives. So if, a lot of companies are coming out in terms of, this is what we stand for, this is who we are, we will do the right thing in society, we look after our people, but we're not transparent about our taxes, kind of has a real negative impact. So disproportionately so. So we're seeing a lot of push with companies, actually just because they can doesn't mean they will anymore, and being much more transparent around how much tax they pay, and where they pay that tax. And I think the whole kind of corporate tax debate, that's a very small part of the total tax take. So there's lots of kind of education around, actually, we need to get the narrative out there for companies to educate their broader stakeholders that they are paying tax. Taxes come in many guises, and in many different forms, but getting that message out there to reassure people that they are doing the right thing has been quite a big push in Europe as well.
So I think you have just summarized our entire first day of global tax here in the US, with a lot of the same issues certainly that we're dealing with here. We started this morning with a session on ESG, the Business Roundtable's revised corporate statement of purpose, trust. And one of the things that's interesting is that the most recent Edelman
the
survey,
trust
the trust barometer, puts trust in business outside the U.S. at a higher figure than trust here in the U.S. Here in the U.S. it's 49%, outside the U.S. it's 61%. So we're seeing that same kind of issue here. We did spend a lot of time this morning talking about what we can do, or what companies have been doing to try to gain more trust. Certainly the tax issue is a big one there. We had Alan Murray from Fortune on this morning, and we talked about what companies can do to get more credit, as you say, for the taxes that they do pay, collect, report on, et cetera, because governments, as a practical matter, at all levels would fail to be able to operate without what business contributes in many ways besides income taxes. But income taxes seems to be the only thing that ever gets any attention.
That's right. And it's really interesting because the Edelman Trust Barometer, they do it every year. And over the last kind of 2 to 3 years, we've seen businesses become more trusted than governments and other organizations. And I think partly that is businesses really responding not just to the business, but to the environment in which they operate, and also being held accountable by their employees and the communities in which they operate as well.
Yeah, which ties to the Edelman survey on employment as well, which said that 63% of employees had a lot of confidence in their employers. It's kind of the local level connection that's working well, even if the higher one isn't. The Pillar 1, Pillar 2 are European companies expecting there to be success on, you mentioned Pillar 2, they're kind of questions. What about Pillar 1? Are they expecting Pillar 1 to ultimately stand up, or to,
I think the jury's still out on that, to be honest. I mean, talking to policymakers, but also, to a number of clients, I think everybody believes that Pillar 2 will happen before Pillar 1. And potentially Pillar 1 will get kicked into the long grass. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know, right? But really, I think people are more focused on Pillar 2 than they are on Pillar 1. It's quite interesting because some people say, well, if we don't do Pillar 1, we're not going to do Pillar 2. They're not intrinsically linked.
No,
actually, they can be naturally separated. And I think some people don't quite understand that.
Yes,
I
that's
think
definitely the case.
what was really interesting, and it would be good to get your perspective from a US perspective, but a lot of the European clients that I've been talking to, are very concerned about how they're going to comply with Pillar 2. They're very concerned about the enormity of the effort that needs to be put in to get the right data, because that data isn't currently available. But they're also really concerned or slightly frustrated about how do we educate our CFOs and our businesses about the importance of this, the investment we need as a business to actually comply. And I think there's some real tension there in Europe, because I think, some people are burying their head in the sand, and some people are modeling everything that moves. And there's a whole spectrum in between. But actually, I think there's a real point, for us and for me as I reflect on it, is how do we get that narrative to a level that's understandable from a business perspective, so that actually companies don't start to fall foul when the rules do come in.
Yes, that's going to be a real challenge. I think here in the U.S. as well, there's a perspective that Pillar 2 is going to be a real compliance issue, and Pillar 1, I don't think anybody thinks is going anywhere anytime soon. So
well, that's good. Again, more similarities.
Yes, that's right. So, Carol, thank you so much for joining us here on Policy on Demand. And thank you. We'll see you all next time.